My name is Bernie Spencer. I am here today to talk a little bit about Latonia and to segue into the aviation meet that took place there in 1909. After which I will give you a little background on what happened to the flyers that were at Latonia, which I find as interesting as the Latonia meet itself. Pretty much what I'm doing today is elaborating on that postcard. That's obviously Latonia. You can see Holy Cross. You can see the hills over in Campbell County. It's an aviation meet. That would explain the airplane. They thought it was in Cincinnati. I was always intrigued by these things in the infield. And I'll get to those. Wait a minute, the mouse is driving me nuts. Latonia, originally Salt Lick, sometimes called Latonian Springs. It was at the corner of Highland Avenue and 3L, about where there is a UDF there today. By 1833, there was a 50-room hotel with a giant piazza. Piazza is European for big porch with a lot of pillars. It really hit the big time in 1833, and it became very popular in 1833 because there was a cholera epidemic in central Kentucky. Lexington, Richmond, that area. And if you had enough money to get out of town, you got out of town, because that's one of the ways you protected yourself from cholera. And a lot of people went north. Why didn't they cross the river to Cincinnati? Because if you had enough money to go away from home and live for a couple of months, you were living with slaves and you didn't take them across the river. While mineral resorts were big before the Civil War, they kind of died afterwards. And the springs died up by 1910, so it was moot. But while they lasted, the Latonia Springs were pleasant and fashionable. Waters are strongly medicinal, read tastes terrible. And it was a good macadamized road. Macadamized was a way to pave roads before they figured out how to pave roads. By 1866, after the war, it was well known, it was popular, but it had to be refitted and refurnished. But it's recommended to invalids and other pleasure seekers. Here we are in 1880. Latonia Springs, beautiful suburb, once a noted watering place. Fine hotel, ample grounds, convenient buildings, waters possess no medicinal values. Nice drive. South Covington. Latonia morphs into South Covington, but when you talk about South Covington, you're not talking about where, you're talking about when. When Eleanor Meehan was writing about Covington, there's a couple of little booklets she wrote. She was talking about 9th and Madison. If you go further into time, by 1867, the suburb that used to be known as the Flats officially became South Covington. In 1877, South Covington's southern border was what you know as Wallace Avenue. But South Covington eventually morphed into Milldale. Why did they call it Milldale? You got a choice. Either it's the old mill that belonged to Charles Mills, or it's the Latonia Distillery, which used to be the Milldale Distillery, owned by J.F. Mills. I can't tell you if the men were related and whether that had something to do with it or not. There is Latonia in 1888. You will notice it's called South Covington. It's also called the Milldale Post Office. The town's called South Covington, the post office is Milldale. I would also point out to you, if I can get the mouse to work, this piece of the railroad right here. Now this one goes up into Covington, goes down into the Corsa Yard, still goes today. This is the old L&N coming up from Louisville, still there today. Still goes across the Licking into Campbell County. This one's gone. But if you go down to Latonia this afternoon and drive roughly where those streets are, you can see exactly where it went. The buildings are curved in one instance. Oh, and by the way, Fairgrounds over here. $18.99. The commercial club, the Latonia Commercial Club, says we need to change this. The town of Milldale Estate exists only in the name of the post office. The name of the office should be the same as that of the city, and I think there will be no trouble in getting it changed, and there was not. So, around 1899, Latonia becomes a place. It lasted 10 years. In those 10 years, they spent a little more money than they took in and said, Covington, please bail us out. And they got annexed by Covington. They have been part of Covington ever since. There has been no such place since 1909 as Latonia. I'm 74 years old. I've always called it Latonia and always will. And you can too, but just so you know. So it has morphed from Latonia Springs to South Covington to Milldale to Latonia, in one instance, Latoniaville, to Covington. The name Latonia derives from the name of the race course, which got its name from the resort, which took its name from the Latin word for a Greek god, which was adapted by the resort's first owner, a man named Latin. Latonia in Roman mythology was known as Leto in Greek. Imagine my surprise last night when I was working a crossword puzzle and it asked me for Leto. She was a daughter of the Titan couple Chios and Phoebe, and was the mistress of Jupiter and conceived two children by him, Diana and Apollos. Anybody want me to pause so they can write all that down? No, good. Latonia grew because of three factors. Covington grows. German immigration, Irish immigration, and just immigration in general. They couldn't go east. There was a river over there. They couldn't go west. There was a big hill over there. So they went south. The other thing that spurred the growth was the railroad, and the other thing was the track. This is Winston Avenue. Nope, don't see Winston Avenue. This is this one. That's the road out to Independence. And down here you can see Ferry Street, Catherine. And what you're seeing is a housing development by the Coppins family and some other people. Massive oaks and beaches, shady promenades, rustic bridges. Obviously the lake's long gone and the massive oaks are long gone, but there are a lot of people living down there today. The other thing that spurred Latonia growth was the Louisville National Railroad. Anybody recognize that locomotive? That is a very famous locomotive on the L&N Railroad called a Big Emma, E-M-M-A, also referred to as an M1. If you find a railroader, he can lecture you for hours about the Emma, Big Emma. The L&N kind of grew and morphed, a lot of little railroads coming together to make a bigger railroad. The Louisville, Cincinnati, and Lexington, also known as the Short Line. No, it's not the Short Line in the Monopoly game. They call it the Short Line because it came up short of going into Louisville. Because as railroads were developing, there were different widths for track. And so when you got, Louisville had one and Cincinnati had another. So from the outskirts of Louisville all the way to Cincinnati was one gauge, but when you got to Louisville, there was a second gauge. I have seen down by the riverfront in Louisville a place where there is a track here, and a track right next to it. 2 gauges. Anyway, eventually DeCourcy Yards, 1918. DeCourcy Yards is what they call a hump yard. Gotta have the mouse for this one. I would point out to you this rail right here. And see it kind of disappears and comes out here. This is a hump. And that hump is how you build a train. You back a train over the hump, and the rail cars go down the other side, over into here. So if you've got a train coming from Detroit, and you want part of it to go to Dallas, and part of it to Atlanta, and part of it to Charlotte, you sort it. I don't know that they use a hump in DeCourcy much anymore, but if you go across the Harrison Avenue Viaduct and look north, you can absolutely see a big hump yard. Latonia, also known for Riddy's Corner. Riddy is the man that owned the bar on that corner, owned it for a lot of years. I would point out to you this thing down here. That's a trough where you could water your horse. Your wagon could pull up to it, or you could ride up to it. It was full of water. Then some idiot invented the automobile. And one day the automobile, driven by a doctor in Latonia, ran into it. And the Latonia city father said, oops, and they rebuilt it. And a couple months later, he ran into it again, and they said, okay. The doctor was known to take a sip from now and then. And the third time they hit it, they decided, he's aiming for it. We're not rebuilding it. And they didn't. Latonia, one of the preeminent racetracks in America in its day. That's the clubhouse. That's the grandstand. There's the aerial view. There's Winston Avenue. There's the railroad. You can see some oil tanks from Standard Oil over here, and some horse barns over here. When it got started, there was no such thing as a photo finish. You had a judge's stand. The judges stood at the finish line and made a determination as to who won and who came in second. There was no such thing as a starting gate. You had a man that was a starter, and when he determined the horses were sufficiently lined up, he threw a flag and they were off. There he is. He's a man named Cassidy, who was a noted starter at Latonia for a lot of years. It was not a place you went in your t-shirt and blue jeans. Opened in 1883, huge crowd. The original big race was the Hindu Stakes, which eventually morphed into the Latonia Derby, which was a big deal. And for many years, rivaled, if not outpaced, the Kentucky Derby, a fact that did not escape the notice of the people that owned Churchill Downs, who bought Latonia, after which the Kentucky Derby purses went up and the Latonia Derby purses went. They held on through the recession until 1939, at which point they sold the property to Standard Oil, who began demolition proceedings pretty much immediately. They raced cars at Latonia. They raced motorcycles at Latonia. I'm pretty much taking that postcard's word on that. That might be a motorcycle there. I can't tell if this thing back here is a motorcycle or a dust speck, but FDR spoke. There was auto racing, there was motorcycle racing, there were political rallies, there were company picnics. They held a steeplechase, and in November 12th and 14th, 1909, they held an aviation meet. Plans are announced. Formed during the last few weeks at a residence on the East Hill Friday night. Read Hyde Park. People there at the meeting included Schenkel, Alt, Levy, Flashman, Schmidlap, Foraker, Anderson, Huntington, Guthrie, Cox, Pattison. If you need a convenient list of who's who in money in Cincinnati in 1909, there's your list. They were going to do something that hadn't been done before. It was not uncommon from 1900 to 1910 for demonstrations of these types of flying things, and understanding in that period of time there's no words yet. Flying machines, aeroplanes, they called them everything in the world. There's no vocabulary. But they were going to have Montgolfier balloons, what you and I know is a hot air balloon. They were going to have gas balloons, which are filled with helium or hydrogen and don't need heat, which means they can stay up a lot longer. They were going to have dirigibles. They were going to have heavier than air flying machines. It would be the first show in America to feature all four. Montgolfier brothers invented the hot air balloon in 1783. They did not go up in the first hot air balloon. They hired some guy to do that. And they were used in any number of wars for reconnaissance. Gas balloons. They hauled 30 tons of iron ore to the track to make hydrogen on the spot, to fill up the gas balloons and the dirigibles. That particular balloon you're looking at is from Ludlow, a man named Frank Grubbs. I do not know why Frank Grubbs was not invited to Latonia. Maybe he was. But you can see the Sleepy Hollow Road railroad trestle, and that is a gas balloon. Dirigibles, and heavier than air machines. There were star attractions, foremost of which was a man named Glenn Curtis. Glenn Curtis made the first public flight of an airplane in the United States. Keyword, public. Wright brothers did the first flight. There's no debate about that. But the Wright brothers were secretive. They did not want you seeing their airplane. They did not want you stealing their ideas. They did not want you anywhere near their airplane. Glenn Curtis didn't care. Glenn Curtis sold the first airplane in the United States, first flight from one American city to the other, and when they started issuing pilot license in this country, his was number 1. He was more famous at the time for riding a motorcycle 136 miles an hour on Daytona Beach, a record that was not broken until 1930. The first successful American-made dirigible, that's Curtis, 1904. He later determined how to fly off a Navy ship, and for World War I, he created 6,800 JN-4 training airplanes. There he is. 1900, I can't read it from here. 1909, 2 months before Latonia. There he is in 1908. There he is up in the air. There's his Flying Jenny. If you're familiar with it, you may be more familiar with it because of its stamp. The other pilot was a man named Charles Willard, who was a student of Curtis, who held the world's record for cross-country flight. But it's 1909, so cross-country flight is we may never know. Come on. Cross-country flight was 12 and a half miles in 15 minutes. Less than 60 miles an hour, I would point out to you. He was a pilot of the first plane to be shot down. Farmer did not know what that contraption was and took his shotgun to it. Everybody was safe. There's Willard in Chicago a year after Latonia. There he is in his airplane, in his suit. Look at the shine on those shoes. There they are at Latonia. I would ask you to look at three things in that picture. One, what are those people doing on the track? Two, you put those two airplanes side by side, they pretty much take up the whole track. Because Latonia was narrower, and then the pilots cared for. They were concerned about their safety and the safety of the people, especially if the people are going to be on the track. Three, I would ask you to look at those automobiles in the lower right. Remember that list of Hyde Park people I told you about earlier? Those aren't Model Ts, folks. Dirigible pilot number one, Cromwell Dixon. And if he looks young to you, he is. He toured with his mother. He was 17 years old at the time of Latonia. He, as a 19-year-old, he would have migrated to airplanes. I'm going to show you three dirigible pilots at Latonia. All three in the coming years are going to migrate to airplanes. He was the first person to fly across the Continental Divide. There he is a year later in Boston with his mother and his sister. There he is in a publicity shot. I don't believe he was ever that young flying dirigibles. But there he is actually flying at Latonia. There he is getting ready to take off on his return flight from his flight over the Continental Divide. He was going to go back. Another dirigible pilot was a man named Augustus Roy Nobbenshoe, a fun name to say. He barnstormed as Professor Don Carlos for a lot of years in his dirigible. He used the name Don Carlos because he had a good job, but he didn't want the people with the job to know what he was doing on the weekends because he considered it about half crazy. Also, he didn't want to embarrass his family about what he was doing. But he eventually made so much money barnstorming, he said, heck with the job and the family, I'm going public, and he did. And one of the ways you make money is you can take people for rides up in your dirigible. Here he is back in 1905. So he's been doing it for a while. You can put people in your dirigible and take them up. Evidently, that was a very popular thing to do at the time. Not with me, they're not, but there he is again in his dirigible. The third pilot of dirigibles at Latonia was a man named Lincoln Beechey. Has anyone in the room ever heard the name Lincoln Beechey? One man. The man who has a booth out here running the Northern Kentucky Aviation Hall of Fame. He knows. There's Lincoln with his dirigible. Well-dressed man. There he is at the Erlanger, Kentucky Fair in 1914. Like I told you, he's gone to airplanes. Erlanger Fairgrounds were where Erlanger Lloyd High School is now. There was a racetrack. There's Lincoln. Uncanny King of the Air. There he is flying under the bridge at Niagara Falls. There he is later barnstorming with Barney Oldfield somewhere. Friday, Latonia Exhibition opens. 5,000 people are inside the track, 5,000 more are outside the gate. Makes sense to me. Why, if your things are up in the air, why would you pay to go inside? At least one passing train stopped so the passengers and the pilot could see what's going on. The Enquirer had 14 column inches on Cincinnati Society members at the event. They saw a man parachute from a hot air balloon, and the dirigibles and the planes ran around the track. Latonia residents never had such an eventful day in their lives as yesterday. Began to fill up improvised grandstands and rooftops. Summer resorts, well patronized. There was a kid in Newport that fell out of the top of a tree trying to see it all. Stable hands on the inside of the track looked on with wonderment. Let's see, we got some people. Mrs. all those guys I read you earlier. I'm not going to read all that. The Inquirer said these illustrations prove that airships are no dream. That's Latonia. There's the grandstand, dirigible, airplane. Sorry about the picture quality, it's what has survived. Airplane 1, Airplane 2, clubhouse, 3 dirigibles, 1, 2, 3. There's Knob and Shoe in what? There's Willard. That looks an awful lot like that postcard I showed you earlier that explained everything. And as long as I said I would tell you, these are the gas balloons that would close the show, and there were tents where they stored the planes overnight. There they are over the judges' stand. There's the tents in the infield. That's Curtis. I don't know this gentleman. The Inquirer says to see the ease with which Curtis and Willard managed their machines, see, we still don't have a word, was a revelation. They flew like swallows and they landed as lightly as a butterfly lights on a rose. There's the results from Friday. Very first flight, Curtis goes up. He went up at 1:55 in the afternoon. Yeah, he went up at 2:07. He went for an eighth of a mile. It took him 10 seconds. He went 15 feet in the air. And you're saying, that was a revelation? Yes. Yes. It's 1909. You're reading in the paper mathematical proofs from eminent people that say it's impossible for something heavier than air to get off the ground. You read it in the out-of-town papers that people flew, and you're thinking, not happening. They're using wires, they're using mirrors. But you show up in Latonia in November of 1909, and there's a guy doing it. It is a revelation. It's a major miracle. The most important thing that happened Friday was this 10-minute thing here by Dixon. Dixon's our 17-year-old who went for 2 miles. It takes longer than 2 miles. It didn't take 2 miles to get along the Latonia track. He decided to see Millvale, so he left the track, cruised the town, and the crowd, as they say, went wild. There was a newspaper woman that went up in Cromwell Dixon's dirigible. Ruth Neely was her name. There she is. She went up in Cromwell Dixon's dirigible. I don't know if she had a conversation with his mother to get that done, but the first woman to fly a dirigible did it at Latonia. Says she wasn't scared in the least. Dirigibles look like the most practical flyers among the aircraft, but planes are stars. These airplane things, last sentence, they still don't have a noun, airplane things, are more scientific, but a dirigible stirs one's imagination more. Yeah, as it turned out, no. On Saturday, Jacob Berg checked the hydrogen production at 3 a.m. in the morning with a lantern. Don't do that. The newspapers have some very graphic descriptions of what happened to Mr. Berg, who held on for 12 hours, had severe burns, and It's ugly. Suffice it to say, everybody in Latonia woke up. Also on Saturday, Dixon's dirigible landed at one point in the crowd, but as the Post graciously noted, the dirigible was okay. Dixon and Beachy both cruised Milldale. I'm sure Beachy decided if Dixon could do it, he could. And the Enquirer ran 19 column inches on society at the event. Speaking of society at the event, my mouse doesn't work. Seriously, people. There's Orville Wright and Alice Roosevelt Longworth. Orville Wright, of course, being one of the Wright brothers, who was not flying at Latonia, but he was in attendance to see which of his ideas had been stolen. Alice, of course, being the daughter of Teddy Roosevelt, who once said of her, anybody? I can run the country or I can control Alice, but I can't do both. There's Orville again, with Curtis on the right. The man in the middle is a man named Robert Reynolds. If you bought ice in the city of Cincinnati in those days, you probably bought it from Robert Reynolds or a company he owned, which was somewhat lucrative. Let me take you back to 1908, a year before. Wilbur, not Orville, Wilbur, who spent a lot of time in Europe selling the planes. Mr. Wright's expectations, I'm in the second paragraph, that the distance of wars would deter spectators from going there to witness the trials of the airplane were not realized. They liked to be secretive. They would demonstrate, but they didn't like to do it in public. Orville maintained his I'm back to Latonia now. Orville maintained his reputation as a man of few words, refused to make any statements for publication regarding the legal contest he has become involved with Glenn Curtis. Glenn Curtis was a magnificent inventor, a brilliant man, terrible businessman. Didn't patent anything, didn't copyright anything, so people stole his ideas pretty freely. To steer the original Wright Brothers flyer, you had two ropes. And to turn, you pulled one way and one the other way. And your plane turned. You want to go the other way, turn the other way. Curtis said, are you kidding me? He invented something called flaps. If you've ever flown in an airplane, your airplane had flaps. That's a Curtis invention. But as I understand patent law, and I don't understand patent law, in 1910, if you had a thing you invented, and somebody else invented something to go on it, their invention became part of your patent. So lawyers got involved. I apologize for the mouse. Miss Longworth was looking very chic yesterday in an iris-colored cloth costume embroidered with braid. The coat was cut rather low, showing her pretty white throat and finished by a broad cover of heavy white lace. Her hat was black with a black feather. A certain womanly grace has supplanted her girlish impetuosity, and it's very charming. That's what you wear to the track. I got more. Miss T.W. Graydon in a beautiful black toilette and a becoming ostrich boa chaperoned a merry group of young people. Among them, Miss Margaret Graydon, very charming in a tailored gown of olive green cloth and a rose hat. Miss Ethel Graydon, distinguee in a taupe gown and we don't say distinguee enough anymore. And a stunning taupe hat with straight, stiff, iridescent wings shading to red and turquoise green. And Miss Marjorie Riekert in an ostrich blue and small black turban. One more, last one. Miss Edmund Miller was very chic in a toilet of violet cloth and a violet hat. Miss Mary Miller was very smart in a severe black walking costume and a black hat with a dash of scarlet velvet. If you want more of that stuff, the Enquirer those days, 19, 20 column inches. There's Curtis on Saturday. There's Willard on Saturday. There's inflating the gas balloons, which would take off on the final day. There's the results from Saturday. The distances are a little greater, the time's a little longer, the height's about the same. Longest and highest of the dirigibles, Lincoln Beechey. One of the things they added, any runners in the room? If you know any runners, you're probably familiar with a race they used to run from the Latonia shopping center to downtown. They still run it every Thanksgiving morning in the tri-state. They've been running it for 100 and so years. If you want to know how many years, subtract current year from 1909, because the very first turkey trot happened as part of the Latonia Aviation meet, which had 17 entries and 9 finishers. On Sunday, it rained and the winds blew. It's November, right? All the participants that had contracted to come and do their thing did their thing, but it was pretty shallow, pretty limited. On Sunday, of the 3 balloons scheduled to go, only 1 took off. Saturday night storms got involved, and the balloon race coast was spoiled by storm. Haddock's balloon, the Wanderer, was torn from its mooring and landed a mile away. Some telegraph wires. The balloon Cincinnati, owned by Fleshman, also damaged. The balloon Dayton by George Howard got away safely, accompanied by 2 newspaper men and provisions of 5 days. Took off at 7:30 Sunday night. It's November. It's cold. It's raining. All he has to do is follow the lights up 75, right? And it's dark. They finally see some lights late in the night, and they're not sure if it's Toledo or Sandusky, but they decided before we start over Lake Erie, let's bring this thing down. The valve won't open. They're going across Lake Erie. And as they circle Lake Erie and they come back around, there's more water. And they're jettisoning stuff because the balloon's coming down. And they don't want to land in the water, so they start throwing stuff out. They cut the anchor, so they no longer have an anchor, just to get rid of the weight. They get very close to the water and land appears. And about the time land appears, they figure out the valve can be opened, and they settled. They were all right. They landed in Derby Station at 5:20 a.m. They had gone 386 miles. They averaged 58 miles an hour. And the farmer at which they landed and took out his outbuilding sent him a bill for $516. Cromwell Dixon. I told you he flew over the Continental Divide. He died on the way back. There he is, getting ready to come back. That would be his last flight. Lincoln Beechey. Lincoln Beechey was portrayed in the press as the most daredevilish man ever to fly an airplane. Beechey bristled at that comment. Beechey took the point of view, no, I have studied aviation, I have studied aeronautics, I have spent thousands of hours in this airplane, and yes, I do remarkable things in it, but I know exactly what this plane will do. I know what it will not do. I am not taking chances. I practice this stuff. But, you know, by 2 or 3 years after Latonia, people like you and me were buying airplanes and learning how to fly them. And in a couple of weeks after we learned to fly, we decided, let's do some of that Lincoln Beachy stuff. They killed themselves. And people didn't blame them, they blamed Beachy. Lincoln Beachy's biographers are all in agreement that it's difficult to separate the things we absolutely know he did that sound preposterous from the things that people just made up and say he did. An example of which is coming up. Yes, my mouse will work. Lincoln Beachy in 1914 toured 126 cities. His average attendance was 100,000. In one 30-week period, 17 million people saw him in person. That's 1 in 5 of every Americans. He earned more for every appearance than the average American made in a year, and it is said he left every town with a lockbox full of cash and a young lady with a diamond ring.
This was a 17 or 19-year-old?
No.
No, this is
Our 17, 19-year-old was the one that died in the
oh, yes,
Dixon. Lincoln Beachy in San Francisco. Defying all laws of gravitation, Lincoln Beachy, undoubtedly the most intrepid aviator in America, gracefully executed an aerial waltz in his Curtiss biplane at Tanniform Park yesterday afternoon. The waltz was danced on a floor of crisp, exhilarating atmosphere to music from the throats of thrilled thousands. Every glide was graceful, every dip delightfully sensational, and every reverse dazzling and daring. As a climax to this thrilling exhibition of atmospheric dancing, Beachy rose to a height of 3,000 feet, tipped his machine until it seemed impossible for him to hold his seat, and with still engines, dropped headlong to within 50 feet of the earth when he raised his hands from the control bar, straightened out his biplane, and landed safely on the green. As he descended into this death dive, a hush fell over the spectators, and the swish of the air through the wings could distinctly be heard. Wow. In Chicago, a couple years after Latonia, a man broke his record on an air show previous to him on the bill. And Beachy got together with his crew, and they decided, well, we can fly our plane higher than 2 miles, but we're going to run out of gas when we get there. Beachy said, no problem, I'll turn it into a glider. And he did, and he got his record back. He was the first man to fly a plane upside down. He was the first man to fly in a 360-degree loop. He was the first man to fly a plane straight down. He was the first man to fly an airplane backwards. He was the first man to fly a plane upside down and backwards. Remember what I told you about the photographers can't agree on? That there are some stories so bizarre you think, no, couldn't possibly happen. Upside down and backwards, Dayton, Ohio, in front of Orville Wright and 5,000 other people. He did her. Man who owns the sky, Alexander the Air, the world's greatest aviator, everyone from flyers to poets to inventors to presidents, inspired thousands to invest their lives in aviation, including Lindbergh, Rickenbacker, LeMay, and Hap Arnold. That's a resume, boys and girls. He had an air show in San Francisco, his hometown. Word got out that there was a new airplane. He wouldn't be flying his old Curtiss airplane. Beachy was uncomfortable about flying the new airplane because, to his point of view, he had not tested it enough, hadn't had enough time in it. But word got out, he didn't want to disappoint the crowd, and we went into his death dive and tried to pull it out. The G-forces took off the wing. Greatest daredevil in the history of America never learned to swim, and he drowned in San Francisco Bay. Ernest Lloyd got tired of fighting with the Wright brothers, gave up on aviation, moved to Florida, and became a real estate developer. Developed a really nifty dune buggy for going hunting and fishing in the Everglades, but died of an appendectomy in 1930. Nobbin later worked as a general manager for the Wright brothers, reconditioned aircraft, worked for the National Park Service. Died in a California trailer park in 1960. Willard spent most of his life as an aviation engineer and lived until 1977. That man lived to see a man walk on the moon. I can only hope some intrepid reporter somewhere had sense to stick a microphone in his face and say, "What do you think?" And that's what happened on November 12th, 13th, 14th in Latonia, Kentucky, or, as the Kentucky Times Star so eloquently noted the following day, they flew. Thank you.